Okay, so we've talked about glomerular filtration. The other main process in processing filtrate and producing urine is tubular reabsorption. So this is a selective transepithelial process, meaning it moves stuff across the epithelial cells of the renal tubule. And most organic nutrients are reabsorbed, so all your glucose, all your amino acids, those are all reabsorbed from the filtrate. And then water and ions are reabsorbed as needed. So if your blood volume's low, it's hormonally regulated, and hormones act to reabsorb more water from the nephron and the collecting duct. And so there's active processes that require energy to pump stuff across the cell membrane, and passive processes where things just diffuse down a gradient. So there's two routes, transcellular and paracellular. Transcellular is transport across the luminal membrane, through the cell, through the cytosol, and across the basolateral membrane, and then through the interstitial fluid and into the capillary. And then the paracellular route is through, so epithelial cells, right here you see, are held together by tight junctions. Those are just proteins that hold together these epithelial cells. And these tight junctions are kind of leaky, and they can allow solutes to dissolve through. So how does tubular reabsorption work? Tubular reabsorption begins as soon as the filtrate enters the proximal convoluted tubule, and involves almost total reabsorption of organic nutrients and hormonally regulated reabsorption of water and ions. So basically what happens, and this is a figure you'll probably recreate in the urinary and renal worksheet. It asks you to draw the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And that's right here on the basolateral membrane. It pumps sodium out and potassium in. So at this basolateral membrane, sodium is, I lost my pointer. Sodium is pumped out of the basolateral membrane, out of the cell, through the basolateral membrane, and into the interstitial space. So we develop a gradient where sodium is high in the filtrate and low in the cell because it's being actively pumped out. So that gradient facilitates sodium entry at the luminal membrane, and then a lot of other organic nutrients and ions are co-transported with sodium as it moves down its concentration gradient. So this protein here, this channel, as sodium diffused in down its concentration gradient, because it's being pumped out of the cell down here, this protein would transport glucose and sodium at the same time. And a separate protein would transport sodium and some amino acid. So this, if it was transporting sodium and glucose, it would be a sodium-glucose cotransporter. Okay, so we're at 1 here. 1 is that sodium-potassium ATPase sets up a gradient so that sodium is leaving the cell, and that creates, if there's high sodium in the filtrate, that means sodium wants to enter the cell from this side, and it can do so through these channels. And then a lot of organic nutrients and some ions are co-transported in along with that sodium when the sodium diffuses in. And they move through the cell, transcellular, into the interstitial fluid, and they're reabsorbed by the peritubular capillary. Now, this sodium gradient, it's a pretty good gradient. We've got sodium leaving here, sodium entering here, also sets up, because more sodium is being pumped out of the cell, water wants to follow it by osmosis. So water gets reabsorbed by osmosis, and when water leaves, it increases the concentration of solutes, the osmolality of solutes that are left behind, so it creates an even bigger gradient for solutes to move down their concentration gradient. Lipid-soluble substances just diffuse through a transcellular route, so they just diffuse across the cell membrane because they can freely diffuse into cells and across cells and into the blood. That's why it's hard to get rid of a lot of lipid-soluble drugs. Lipid-soluble contaminants like PCBs tend to stay in your body because they can just dissolve right out of your kidney, right out of your nephron and into the peritubular capillary. And then chloride, calcium, potassium, some other ions, and a little bit of urea just diffuse through the paracellular route between cells, through those leaky tight junctions, and into the peritubular capillary. So what's active and what's passive? This is active, the pumping of sodium out and potassium in, and that requires energy. This is called secondary active transport because it uses the energy. This gradient was set up using energy, and it uses this gradient. It uses the energy from that gradient to diffuse through. This is passive, this is passive, this is passive. Okay, so what parts of the renal tubules absorb what? So the proximal convoluted tubule is where most reabsorption happens. 65% of the filtrate volume is reabsorbed. So a lot of 65% of sodium and water, and almost all of your glucose and amino acids are reabsorbed here. Some drugs are secreted. Some small proteins that pass through, that are able to pass through the filtration membrane are reabsorbed as well. And then hydrogen ions and ammonia acids are secreted, and bicarbonate is absorbed in order to maintain blood pH, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about acid-base balance. And then some drugs are secreted from the blood into the proximal convoluted tubule as well. The loops of Henle. So the descending loop of Henle is freely permeable to water, but not permeable to sodium chloride, salt, or a lot of other solutes. So the filtrate becomes increasingly concentrated as water leaves by osmosis. This filtrate becomes increasingly concentrated. The ascending loop of Henle is impermeable to water, so water doesn't leave here, but sodium, chloride, potassium. So in the ascending loop, we pump out sodium, chloride, and potassium, and in the thick segment and in the thin segment, sodium and chloride diffuses out. So the filtrate becomes increasingly dilute as it ascends, and as salt is reabsorbed So the distal convoluting tubule and collecting duct reabsorption is hormonally regulated. Calcium reabsorption increases with parathyroid hormone. Water reabsorption increases with ADH, and sodium reabsorption is regulated by aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide. So here we have the distal convoluted tubule. So we're in this part of the nephron now. So aldosterone actively increases the active reabsorption of sodium. So basically it inserts more sodium transporters into the membrane. Parathyroid hormone promotes the reabsorption of calcium, and chloride just tends to follow sodium. In the collecting duct, so now we're pretty much out of the nephron and into the collecting duct. So water is reabsorbed through aquaporins or water channels. Excuse me. Those are regulated by antidiuretic hormone. So ADH inserts aquaporins into the membrane here in this collecting duct, and it causes more water to be reabsorbed. Aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption and decreases potassium secretion. And then bicarbonate, hydrogen, and ammonia are secreted or reabsorbed to maintain blood pH. Now, that's all tubular reabsorption, or how things are reabsorbed. Tubular secretion is the opposite thing. It's stuff moving from the blood through the interstitial fluid and then into the renal tubule. So some things that can be secreted are potassium, hydrogen ions, ammonia, creatinine, organic acids, and they move from the peritubular capillaries or tubular cells into the filtrate. Tubular secretion can, if we remember, plasma proteins aren't filtered, so substances that are bound to plasma proteins stay in our blood unless they're actively secreted. It can also eliminate undesirable substances that have been passively reabsorbed. Remember, just because of the diffusion gradients in the proximal convoluted tubule, we reabsorb some urea, so we can also actively secrete that. We can get rid of excess potassium and control blood pH by altering the amount of hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions that are secreted in urine and removed from the blood.